Only one day remained until his execution. Mark Thompson leaned against the cold prison cell wall, his eyes closed. 5 years had passed, but the memories of that night remained vivid. His wife Kate's pale face lying in the lion enclosure at the wildlife center, and Simba appearing the next day covered in blood. Everything felt as fresh as yesterday. Moments later, the iron door opened and the prosecutor entered. This cold-faced prosecutor had consistently argued for Mark's guilt and was ultimately responsible for Mark receiving the death penalty. He was a man of principles, someone who compromised with no one. Cold in nature, the prosecutor asked Mark to state his final wish before death. Mark slowly lifted his head. His promising life as an animal behavior researcher, the happy days with his wife Kate. He never imagined it would end so emptily. After some thought, Mark said he wanted to see Simba one last time, the lion he had been researching. The prosecutor hesitated. In principle, death row inmates were not allowed outside visits. However, he couldn't bring himself to refuse the final request of a condemned man he had helped create. The prosecutor agreed to Mark's request on the condition that he accompany him. A few hours later, Mark boarded the transport bus in handcuffs. The African savanna landscape visible through the window felt both unfamiliar and nostalgic. The transport bus stopped in front of the wildlife center. At the center entrance stood a familiar face. It was Scott, a 20-year friend of both Kate and Mark, and the director of this wildlife center. The three had been like family since their school days, and for the past 5 years since Kate's death, Scott had visited Mark in prison every week to comfort him. Scott was the only precious friend Mark had left. Scott approached and placed his hand on Mark's shoulder. Words weren't necessary. Scott knew how difficult it had been for Mark, how unfair everything was. But the prosecutor, watching from the side, demanded that Scott step back. Contact with prisoners was prohibited. Watching the prosecutor's cold expression, Mark felt the wretchedness of being treated as a criminal, even in this final moment. Moments later, a zookeeper brought out a lion from the large enclosure. It was Simba. He had grown much larger and stronger than 5 years ago. Mark's heart raced. This was the lion he had studied and cared for since it was a cub, the only remaining connection to Kate. Mark smiled brightly, knelt down, and reached out his hands. But Simba's reaction was different from before. Simba stood at a distance, staring toward Mark. In the past, Simba would always run happily into Mark's arms whenever he saw him. But now, Simba's eyes looked unfamiliar. Suddenly, Simba began growling. The guards tensed and raised their guns, and the zookeeper hurriedly approached Simba. But Simba didn't stop the threat. Instead, he lowered his body, taking a stance as if to charge forward. He looked as if he was furious at Kate's murderer. In that moment, Simba exploded. He shook off the zookeeper holding him and sprang forward like lightning. Mark looked at Simba with surprise. But Simba ran past Mark at full speed and lunged at Scott. Scott screamed and fell backward, and Simba jumped on top of him, tearing at Scott's pants. Simba was glaring at Scott with eyes that seemed to know something. Only after several zookeepers rushed over and held on could they barely pull Simba away. Scott sat on the ground, breathing heavily. His face was completely pale. Then, through the torn pants, Scott's leg was revealed. Mark's eyes fixed on that scar. A deep, old scar. Clearly teeth marks. Marks from a large animal's teeth. No, precisely. A predator's teeth. Having studied animals for over 20 years, Mark could immediately tell that the scar was from a lion bite. Mark and Scott had always been together, sharing everything. If Scott had been bitten by a lion, there was no way Mark would know. Mark quietly asked Scott about the wound. For a moment, a look of panic was clearly visible on Scott's face, but he quickly forced a smile and said he was bitten last year while helping transport a lion. And he added that he deliberately didn't mention it, worried that Mark in prison would worry. Mark felt sorry for having doubted Scott even momentarily. Then someone quietly approached from the side. It was an old employee of the center who had been close with Kate. He knew the ins and outs of the wildlife center better than anyone. The employee, who had been listening to Scott's story from the side, looked at Scott with a smiling face and said that wound was from right after the incident with Dr. Kate 5 years ago. He said he saw the director take a week of sick leave and walk around with his leg bandaged for a while. "Director, you must be confused because you've been so busy lately," he said. A moment of silence fell. The prosecutor looked at Scott with suspicion. Scott's face turned pale, and Mark's mind went blank. 5 years ago, the night Kate died. Simba appearing to Mark covered in blood. And Scott, who was bitten by a lion that same day. The puzzle pieces that had been lost in mystery seemed to be coming together. 5 years ago, that day was Mark and Kate's wedding anniversary. Kate, the veterinarian in charge of Simba, was working the night shift at the wildlife center. Thinking of Mark waiting at home, she hurriedly checked on Simba's condition. At that moment, Scott, who had just finished baseball practice with the staff and was heading to his office, caught sight of Kate alone in the lion enclosure. The truth was, Scott had been in love with Kate for a long time. The three were friends, but he had always envied Mark, who was with Kate. He wanted to have Kate, even if just for a moment. Scott slowly approached Kate from behind and embraced her. Kate screamed and struggled to break free. Shocked, Scott covered Kate's mouth, trying to calm her down. Right then, Simba lunged at Scott. Simba's teeth sank deep into Scott's leg. Scott screamed and swung the baseball bat at Simba, and with a thud, something fell. It was Kate. The baseball bat swung at Simba, struck Kate's head, and her body collapsed helplessly. Scott's mind went blank. With trembling hands, he checked Kate's pulse, but Kate was already dead. Scott, quietly looking at Kate, removed the wedding ring from Kate's hand and put it in his pocket. She was the woman he couldn't have for 20 years. He wanted to keep her forever, even in this way. Scott looked around. Simba had disappeared, and on the floor lay the bloody baseball bat. Scott's initials were engraved on the baseball bat. After thinking for a while, Scott buried the baseball bat near the lion enclosure. He thought hiding it inside the center, which he could control, was the safest. Then he entered the main server room and deleted all the CCTV footage. Critical evidence was disappearing one by one. Now all that remained was Scott's own alibi. Scott rushed downtown and bought a ticket for a movie that had already started. Then he entered a nearby restaurant, ordered food, and kept talking to the server as if wanting to be remembered. This is how Scott created an alibi for the perfect crime. Simba, leaving the wildlife center, went to find Mark, covered in blood. Mark was so shocked to see Simba that he hugged him. The blood on Simba's body got on Mark's clothes and hands. Residents who saw Simba called the police, and shortly after, sirens sounded as police burst into Mark's house. Mark, covered in blood, was arrested on the spot as a suspect in Kate's murder. After that, an investigation was conducted to find the culprit, and Scott was cleared of suspicion with his solid alibi. Eventually, Mark was imprisoned as the prime suspect in Kate's murder. Mark, who had lost his beloved wife, was now also framed for her murder. Mark claimed innocence and requested the CCTV be checked, but the CCTV footage Scott had deleted was impossible to recover. There was no way left to prove Mark's innocence. For 5 years after that day, Scott visited Mark every week to comfort him, and he found a competent lawyer to help with the defense. Mark relied completely on Scott. Scott was the only person he could trust and depend on. Before Mark's final trial, Scott visited Mark's lawyer whom he had hired, and he spoke quietly. Don't drag the trial out too long. Ending the painful time quickly would be for Mark's sake. The lawyer, following Scott's request, defended passively in the final trial, and Mark was ultimately sentenced to death. After hearing the staff member's story, the prosecutor looked sharply at Scott and quietly spoke. Mr. Scott, do you have any record of visiting a hospital around the time Dr. Kate died 5 years ago? Scott replied with a flustered expression that getting bitten by animals was common while working at the Wildlife Center, and he confidently stated that he was watching a movie during the time Kate was murdered and had submitted all the evidence. He was very displeased that they were bringing up charges that had already been fully investigated 5 years ago. The prosecutor, after thinking for a moment, called an investigator to request access to Scott's medical records from the past 5 years. Accessing the records usually took about 30 minutes. Scott kept anxiously checking the time. The prosecutor, watching Scott's anxious behavior, seemed to be certain of something. Right at that moment, Simba, who had been next to the zookeeper, ran somewhere and started digging in a corner of the center. Everyone looked at Simba's behavior with confused expressions. At that moment, cold sweat ran down Scott's back. Scott was the only person who knew what was buried there. He thought his life would be over the moment the buried bat was discovered. He had to stop Simba somehow. Scott suddenly shouted loudly that according to animal protection laws, animals that attack humans must be euthanized, and he ordered that Simba be euthanized immediately under his authority as center director. When the staff hesitated, he threatened that any employee who disobeyed orders would be immediately fired. The staff were bewildered, but they couldn't disobey their superior's orders. One hesitant staff member aimed a tranquilizer gun at Simba. At that moment, Mark shouted at Scott, "What are you doing, Scott? Don't kill Simba." The prosecutor also had no authority to stop Scott without solid evidence. Then a call came from the investigator. They confirmed Scott's medical records showed he received hospital treatment the day after Kate was murdered, and it was recorded as a wound from being bitten by a large predator. The prosecutor blocked the staff member about to shoot and began interrogating Scott, but Scott was confident. He said there were other predators besides Simba at this center, so the legitimate treatment he received 5 years ago wasn't a problem. He even threatened to sue the prosecutor for false accusation, and he urged the staff to proceed with Simba's euthanasia. The staff looked troubled. Although it was their superior's order, euthanizing an animal they'd grown attached to in this manner was hard to accept. Seeing this, Scott snatched the tranquilizer gun the staff member was holding and aimed it directly at Simba himself. Right at that moment, the prosecutor's shout echoed through the center. "Everyone freeze! As of this moment, based on a formally issued warrant, I am taking control of this center." Scott, who had been aiming the tranquilizer gun at Simba, looked at the prosecutor and said he had no such authority. The prosecutor then showed Scott the warrant transmitted to his phone. Scott looked at the prosecutor with disbelieving eyes. The prosecutor looked at Scott with sharp eyes and asked, "Mr. Scott, 5 years ago, you were watching a movie when Kate was murdered, weren't you? Did you enjoy it?" Scott fell silent. The prosecutor then said he was asking based on a formally issued warrant and demanded Scott answer again. Scott, hesitating, replied that it was a movie he really wanted to see, and although he was alone, he enjoyed watching it all the way through. The prosecutor looked directly at Scott and spoke. "Mr. Scott, as of this moment, I am redesignating you as a prime suspect in Dr. Kate's murder case. I'm sorry, but the movie you submitted as evidence didn't finish showing due to a power outage. Your submitted evidence is invalid. You will remain under my control until the reinvestigation is complete." 30 minutes earlier, at the prosecutor's request, the investigator had visited the movie theater box office employee to ask about the situation. The employee said it was the first time someone bought a ticket for a movie that was almost over, so they clearly remembered Scott. And critically, they also remembered that the building had a power outage that day, interrupting the movie screening. Based on this fact, the investigator was able to obtain an emergency warrant and immediately send it to the prosecutor. Suddenly, Scott dropped the tranquilizer gun he was holding and looked somewhere with a pale face. Simba, who had been digging in the corner for a while, was walking over with a bloody baseball bat in his mouth. Simba stopped in front of the prosecutor with the baseball bat still in his mouth. The prosecutor examined the baseball bat carefully. Scott's name was clearly engraved on the bat. It was the very baseball bat Scott had buried 5 years ago. The prosecutor immediately ordered the officers to search Scott's office. The officers entered the center and began searching Scott's office. A few minutes later, one officer found a small gold ring under a flower pot. After checking the ring, the prosecutor ordered the officers to arrest Skeet immediately. Inside the ring were Mark and Kate's initials engraved. It was Kate's wedding ring that had disappeared from the murder scene 5 years ago. Scott was arrested on the spot, and Mark, seeing this, collapsed and cried for a long time, thinking he had lost both his beloved wife and friend. His tears wouldn't stop. The bloody bat found at the Wildlife Center was sent to the Forensic Science Laboratory, and results came back matching Kate's blood. Based on this, the prosecutor formally indicted Scott, and Scott was detained in court. During questioning, Scott slowly began to speak about his motive. He said he had always been in Mark's shadow since their school days. Mark was good at studying and sports, and most importantly, Kate chose Mark. He said that although he had money and the position of Wildlife Center director, it was useless, and Kate still only looked at Mark. He said when he saw Kate alone at the center that night, he thought it was his last chance, but he was rejected once again. He confessed that the emotions he'd held back for 20 years exploded in that moment, and he had been broken since Kate chose Mark. The prosecutor looked at Scott with a bitter smile. It was a tragedy brought about by twisted desire. An hour later, the prosecutor received an emergency court order. Mark Thompson's guilty verdict was overturned, and Mark was immediately released. The prosecutor warmly hugged Mark and said he was sorry for everything. Mark slowly walked out of the prison doors. It was his first time outside in 5 years. Mark went straight to find Simba after leaving prison. Now, all Mark had left was Simba. Simba was still in the same lion enclosure where Kate had fallen. With the zookeeper's help, Mark entered the enclosure. After 5 years, he knelt before Simba and they looked at each other. Mark embraced Simba and petted him for a long time. It was Simba he had missed so much. 5 years ago, Kate had been with them. But now, only Simba and Mark remained. Mark took out a small bouquet from his pocket. They were Kate's favorite flowers. He carefully placed the flowers on the ground where Kate had fallen. Then he took Kate's wedding ring from his pocket and placed it on the ground along with the ring he'd been wearing. With a trembling voice, he spoke. He was sorry he couldn't protect her, to rest peacefully there, that he would follow soon. Mark lifted his head and looked at Simba. Without Simba, he would have remained in people's memories forever as someone who killed the person he loved. Mark embraced Simba again, the only connection to Kate. Strangely, it felt as if Kate had helped him through Simba. He could feel Kate's spirit in Simba. Mark dug a small hole in the ground, placed the two rings side by side in it, and covered them with dirt again. He placed his hand on the ground and whispered, "We will now be together forever here with Simba. No need to be lonely anymore." And finally, he bowed his head and prayed for Kate. Shortly after, footsteps could be heard from behind. The prosecutor, officers, and center staff had all come to the center to comfort Mark. They all stood behind Mark and observed a moment of silence for Kate. Mark was no longer alone. Mark lifted his head and looked at the sky. Somewhere, it felt like Kate was looking down at him with a smiling face.